Aloha pae, dear friends. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mai haere mai, nā mai haere mai ki tēnei session. In this session we're going to explore the growth and the development of the Baha'i community in Aotearoa, New Zealand over the past 25 years, what the Universal House of Justice have described as the fifth epoch. This session is presented at the request of the National Spiritual Assembly, but it should in no wise be taken as a formal statement from the National Spiritual Assembly. Firstly, we'll look at the concept of organic growth. Secondly, we'll have a look at a quick summary of the New Zealand Baha'i community up until 1996. We'll identify the framework of action for the plans of the fifth epoch. We'll look at the contribution of the individual, the role of the institutions, and the role of the community, and how the community has grown over that period of time. Lastly, we'll have a look at the lessons that we've learned and how that sets us up for the future. Firstly, have a look at this principle of organic growth. One of the essential teachings of the Baha'i faith is that religion is a living entity. It is not dead, it is not static. It moves, it grows, it develops, it operates within the hearts of human beings, and it embraces the entire earth. Abdu'l-Baha, in his statement back in 1910, said, "In this world we judge a cause or movement by its progress and development. Some movements appear, manifest a brief period of activity, then discontinue. Others show forth a greater measure of growth and strength, but before attaining mature development, weaken, disintegrate, and are lost in oblivion. Neither of these mentioned are progressive and permanent. There is still another kind of movement or cause, which from very small, inconspicuous beginnings goes forward with sure and steady progress, gradually broadening and widening until it has assumed universal dimensions. The Baha'i movement is of this nature." What does that look like, and how is that manifest in Aotearoa, New Zealand? If we reflect back on the history of the Baha'i community within New Zealand, we see that it was established during the days of Abdu'l-Baha, that there were at least two people who, in their hearts and in their minds, had embraced the Baha'i cause during the lifetime of Abdu'l-Baha. We know that Margaret Stevenson was one of these people. However, the faith didn't really grow in New Zealand until the 1920s, when two pioneers, John Henry and Clara Hyde Dunn, pioneered from the United States, moved to Australia and came over to New Zealand and were engaged in teaching activities. And during this period of time, a number of younger people largely became Baha'is. They embraced the faith, and the faith grew very, very slowly from these inconspicuous beginnings that Abdu'l-Baha talks about. In fact, it was so inconspicuous that at the time of the formation of the National Spiritual Assembly in 1957, there were only 143 believers and 2 local spiritual assemblies established. However, that changed pretty rapidly. The National Spiritual Assembly began to make plans, began to develop, and then a number of things happened. In the 1960s, there was an influx of pioneers from the United States, and they began teaching the faith, particularly amongst the youth. And as a result of that, enrolments took place. Hundreds, possibly even thousands, we're not quite certain, of people entered the Baha'i community. Many, of course, left, but the vast majority that stayed continued to work for the faith and have been the backbone of the cause in carrying it forward. A second key movement that accelerated the Baha'i community was the migration of Pacifica. Quietly, in the 1970s, many Pacific Islanders came to New Zealand from Samoa and Tonga largely, but also from others, from Cook Islands, from other islands within the Pacific, and some of them had embraced the faith within their own countries, and others embraced the faith while they were here. So gradually we had a strong Pacific element develop within the Baha'i community. A third thing which happened, particularly in the 1980s, was engagement of a significant number of Māori in the cause. Now, there had always been activities to reach out to Māori. There had been a number of Māori believers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but limited to only a handful really. And in the 1980s, there was an acceleration of this activity, so that by the early to mid-1990s, there were regular annual Māori conferences, often attended by up to 200 Māori believers. A fourth aspect which contributed to the growth of the New Zealand Baha'i community, that is, of course, apart from just general teaching by the rank and file of many Baha'is, was the influx during the 1980s of Persian refugees, Iranian friends who were escaping the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran as a result of the Iranian Revolution, which had taken place in that country. All of this contributed to a growing, a very warm, a very diverse, a talented, and an enthusiastic community. Perhaps the crowning glory of that was the 1996 conference, the Pacific Horizons Conference, which many of you will remember, which the talents of the New Zealand Baha'i community, and indeed the Pacific, were on show. However, independent of the strengths of the Baha'i community, there were also challenges. There was a somewhat congregational culture with low participation in the actual teaching work or direct delivery of activities by the rank and file. There was often a number of people who were known as either public speakers or were able to give deepenings or firesides, and these were people that were heavily relied on. Māori and Pacifica, even though they had grown on numbers, often felt marginalised. The dominant European Pākehā culture within Aotearoa, New Zealand, was somewhat alienating on a number of occasions to many of the Māori and Pacifica friends. New Zealand also was challenged with the issues which were confronting the world internationally and which were articulated by the Universal House of Justice. And they asked a number of questions that they were wanting to have answered by the Baha'i world. The first of these was, how could the processes of expansion and consolidation work hand in hand to sustain growth? In other words, what had happened is that even though the Baha'i community had grown, and had certainly grown in New Zealand from very, very rapidly over a period of 2 decades, from 140 odd to 3,000 odd in 1996, relying and depending on each other, they were often seen as individual and isolated activities. The House of Justice identified there were three participants in civilization building: the individual, the institutions, and the community, and that growth and development depended upon an effective alignment between these three protagonists. They identified three areas of endeavour: expansion and consolidation, discourses in society, and social action. In the same message, they identified what they described and became dominant over this period of time as what they described as the engine of growth, which was the institute process, a process of learning, of consulting, of reflecting, of putting things into action, and again studying, consulting, reflecting, and putting things into action. The framework of action for the fifth epoch also involved, as a result of this training and institute process, the establishment of core activities, in addition to the establishment of other teaching and development methods that we were well familiar with, such as firesides and deepenings and public talks. In addition to that, core activities such as devotional meetings, study circles, home visits, children's classes, and junior youth activities also became recognised as core activities. The concept of the cluster was recognised as a key part of the framework of action for New Zealand as well, and for the world. We also were encouraged to work in cycles of activity and to work in a systematic process so that we could see progress. The concept of decentralising activities was also an essential part of the plan, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then we're also involved in this concept of community building, both across the clusters that we had established and within specific intense settings or neighbourhood. Let's look a little bit at how this systematic framework of action unfolded over the last 25 years. Firstly, it's important to reinforce again that it was an evolutionary process and that it was based on a worldwide system of learning, of people who were able to learn not only by study but also by growing through doing and through action, and then consulting and reflecting on that. The 25 years had a series of plans. The first was from 1996 to 2000, and the key focus that came out of that was the establishment of the institute process. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, as to how that took place in New Zealand. The second plan was just 1 year, and that was from in the year 2000 through to Rizwan, April of 2001, and it had a focus on the development and the education and the importance of developing spirituality and moral concepts within children and the younger generation. Then from 2001, we had a series of 4 5-year plans, the first of which identified how we could sector and cluster communities. The concept of the establishment of core activities within these clusters became important, and we also established processes of collecting information, statistics, and measuring our growth. In 2006 to 2011, the second 5-year plan, we looked at trialling systematic growth with a landscape of unfolding processes, emerging structures, and enduring fellowship, and we looked to establish what we understood as intensive programs of growth, which New Zealand was to establish 9 of these intensive programs of growth, and the world Baha'i community as a whole was being requested to establish 1,500. The third 5-year plan was from 2011 to 2016. And during that period of time, the New Zealand National Spiritual Assembly, in consultation with the councillors, adopted the goal of having a program of growth based on the concepts that arose out of the institute process in every cluster in New Zealand, bar the Chatham Islands. And then What also took place in that plan was the initiation and the development of learning about the penetration of Baha'u'llah's light into specific receptive populations, often Pacifica, and also Māori, but others as well, in small settings, in neighbourhoods. And we learned about that, began learning about that during that plan. In 2016 to 2021, the last 5-year plan of this epoch, all clusters were encouraged to move to an intensive program of growth. 4 clusters were encouraged to move beyond that, and also we were learning about significant progress and the significant penetration of Baha'u'llah's light into specific neighbourhoods. I have outlined an overview, the framework of action as articulated in the messages from the Universal House of Justice early in the epoch, and then as it evolved over a period of time. Now let's look how that was applied in New Zealand, and let's start with the Institute process. Baha'u'llah had written to Nasruddin Shah over 100 years ago that ere long shall the snow-white hand of God rend an opening through the darkness of this night and unlock a mighty portal unto his city. On that day shall the people enter therein by troops. The House of Justice members and others have stated that they believe that this applies to the Institute process. As I mentioned, in the first 4-year plan, establishing Institute processes throughout the world, including in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Institute establishment was of critical importance. In New Zealand, we established the Aotearoa Institute Board with a number of members and also with a coordinator who travelled around the country and identified what the needs of the Institute process might be and what that might look like. As a result of this, the first fruit from the Aotearoa Institute Board was a video called True Liberty, which was accompanied by a workbook and which was rolled out through the country in response to the need for the New Zealand Baha'i community to embrace some of the spiritual and moral concepts that were enshrined in the Revelation. However, the Institute Board continued to search for an approach to the curriculum for the Institute process. It looked in particular at the United States, it saw what other countries were doing, and finally a number of friends, including those on the Aotearoa Institute Board and the National Spiritual Assembly, became acutely aware of the Ruhi Institute and what had taken place in South America and how that institute and its curriculum was adopted by many countries throughout the world. As a result of this, in 2001, the National Spiritual Assembly adopted the Ruhi curriculum. Initially, the methods of the curriculum were not necessarily understood or appreciated by many because they required not only an understanding of concept, but also a committing to memory of certain passages and the carrying out of practice elements and, perhaps more importantly, the implementation of service activities which flowed from it. It was not simply a deepening exercise, it was a training course, a training for action course. However, over the following 2 decades, the implementation of the elements of the Ruhi curriculum developed and evolved. As I'm sure you're all well aware, there are 7 books in the main sequence of courses of the Ruhi curriculum. The first of which is focused on the life of the spirit, and the second of which focuses on understanding some key themes which are essential to understanding Baha'i concepts. The third is focused on the establishment of an appropriate education process for children and the kind of moral and spiritual foundation that this should provide. The fourth one is devoted to the lives of the twin manifestations of God, the Bob and Baha'u'llah. The fifth of these focuses on the establishment of capabilities within the very important population of junior youth, those between the ages of 11 and 15. The sixth focuses on methods of teaching and the growth of the expansion of the faith. And the last one focuses on tutoring and enabling people to develop the skills and requirements to tutor the other books in the sequence of courses. The growth of the main sequence of courses over the years has been quite significant. Of course, there was no written curriculum when the series of plans began, but from 2001 through to 2021, almost 2,000 people completed the first book in the sequence of courses. Up to almost 1,200 people completed the second, and so on through to some 625 that had completed all 7 books. In addition to that, as you're also aware, over the course of the plans, a number of other books appeared considered to be higher grade courses, which were focused on various aspects, of which some 407 at the end of the plan people had begun on this process and journey investigating in these higher courses. Let's also just identify another element of the framework of action, which I mentioned before, and that is clustering. Now, the House of Justice described the cluster as a geographical unit which reflected the social and economic patterns of activity of the general community. Initially, the National Spiritual Assembly, in consultation with the councillors, had identified 28 clusters. This was reduced to 24. 3 of those clusters at the beginning of the series of plans were unopened, and the other 25 had a beginning program of growth. In October 2021, there was only one unopened cluster, which is Chatham Islands. All of them are at various stages in the growth process. 5 of them still have just a program of growth, but nevertheless a program of growth in which activities are taking place, the institute process is established, core activities are moving forward. Some 16 of these have intensive programs of growth in which the full machinery of the growth processes is operating, and I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then 2 of them are past what we call the third milestone, which means that there is at least 100 core activities and the friends are engaged in a significant number of activities reaching out into the community with a well-functioning, vibrant community. Now, many of you will be aware that prior to 1996, teaching was carried out largely through firesides or public meetings and public talks. There was deepening for Baha'is, and often these activities were confined to a few who were seen as being highly competent in these areas. However, part of the processes of the new epoch was to establish a much more universal approach to engagement of all the friends in activities. And a whole new series of concepts came which were going to assist with growth. New instruments were developed through the institute process. As a result of the study of Book 1, The Life of the Spirit, a service element was to establish a devotional meeting. Children's classes were generated from Book 3. Home visits from Book 2. Junior youth group activities were established as a result of Book 5. Study circles as a result of Book 7, as well as continuing through teaching and teaching teams and various other teaching methods which were all mentioned in Book 6. The House of Justice stated that in order to achieve these goals and to implement this process, initiative, resourcefulness, courage, audacity, consecration, zeal, confidence, tenacity were required. They also mentioned that the institute process should be seen as a creative matrix a framework within which individuals can experiment, how they do book one, how they do book two, the population, the methods of delivery, all sorts of things could be utilised within this creative matrix. However, they requested that believers have a humble posture of learning, and that what needs to take place is that we need to learn about new concepts of growth. Yes, we had established a certain pattern of activity and it had been quite successful for us, but there were all of these unanswered questions, which I mentioned earlier on, and a humble posture of learning was now needed and now required to enable us to take steps towards the next level of operation. There was some initial resistance, some initial doubts and misgivings. In addition to that, there were also some zealots who often shared information which was not correct, and often did it in a way that may not have been wise in hindsight. Now, the House of Justice addressed this directly to the New Zealand Baha'i community, and in 2008 it wrote in response to a convention message, "We are impelled to call upon all members of your Baha'i community," that's in New Zealand, "to put aside any other concerns and to join together in a united endeavour to pursue the objectives of the 5-year plan." That didn't quite work so well. And then in 2009, "We appeal to the devoted servants of the cause in your region to put aside all misgivings and undeflected by distractions, offer wholehearted support to the vital work to which you have been summoned." And then in 2010, they wrote again, "Surely now the Friends could embrace these processes." So there was a period of time of resistance within the New Zealand Baha'i community to the new framework of action, and it was challenging. However, little bit by little bit, day by day, the Friends, after testing it, finding out, responded positively. So much so that by halfway through the process, in fact, perhaps a little bit after halfway through, in 2016, the House of Justice was able to write to the New Zealand Baha'i community how delighted we were to receive the message from the National Convention and note its spiritually charged atmosphere, which was heightened by exhilarating accounts from the teaching field received throughout the course of that gathering. We share the delegates' joy at witnessing the progress made in New Zealand in recent years, which clearly demonstrates both the growing capacity of the Friends to apply the provisions of the plan and the high level of receptivity among their compatriots. So, New Zealand being New Zealand, and of course many of you like myself are very strong patriots. We have to test something first. Nobody's going to tell us what to do. Finally, we figure it all out and then we do it ourselves in our own way. And that's in fact what happened. So let's have a look at how it all panned out, and let's look at a few numbers. And you can see that there was an initial embrace of study circles by a range of participants. However, this dropped off after 2010. Over the next 5 years, there was relatively limited participation, and then from 2017 onwards, there's been significant growth in participation in study circles, so much so that by October of this year, there was some 850 people involved in study circles. It's also noteworthy to see those who are not enrolled as Baha'is, but friends of the community, how they have participated. And again, there is a reflection after 2017 of a significant growth of those participation, of that community's participation, in fact doubling. Let's also have a look at the core activities which have been generated by the Institute process and how individuals have carried these out. Now, let's first look at it in terms of total numbers of activities, and we can see that there was a growth in core activities initially that leveled off, a little blip of a bit more activity in 2010, which was the end of the second 5-year plan, and then dropped off a little bit through most of the next 5-year plan, and then in 2019 accelerated significantly. With respect to participation in junior youth groups, this was very, very interesting. You can see in the blue area, those are the participants from members of the Baha'i community. And you can see how this particular portal has been an opportunity for many in the broader community, indicated by orange, to become involved in the spiritual and moral empowerment program that the junior youth program is. If we move on to children's classes, you can also see in the orange area how this has grown and has become a very, very solid activity for many friends in the broader community, while at the same time being something that has had a reasonably solid number of participants or friends within the Baha'i community. If we have a look at devotional meetings, this is a very interesting graph in which we can see an initial uptake in the early years of the first 5-year plan from 2002 through 2006, a little bit of a drop off in the years from 2006 through 2008, a regrowth, and then a huge acceleration in 2018 till the end of the last 5-year plan. All of these activities, devotional meetings, children's classes, study circles, junior youth groups, have all been inspired by the Institute process, and all of them represent activities, hundreds, thousands of activities that have been carried out by individuals that have been moved by the Institute process, individuals that have been trained. All of these represent a significant amount of individual sacrifice, of planning, of identifying how people are going to work with these instruments, and then of applying them in the field of action, of learning from them, reapplying. And as you can see from the figures, they have been successful not only in expanding the numbers of these devotional meetings and children's classes and core activities, but also expanding the participants, and of significant note, expanding those in the broader community who are participating in these activities. So individuals have aligned themselves with the provisions of the epoch, the provisions of the plans, and moved the cause significantly forward with these new instruments. Let's now turn to the role of the institutions within this process. Back in 1996, the institutions consisted primarily of local spiritual assemblies, the National Spiritual Assembly and its committees, and auxiliary board members and councillors. However, the structure of the institutions, as with the role of the individuals, was subject to organic growth and to change. For assemblies, it meant a whole range of things. The House of Justice identified that the assemblies are the voice of moral authority and still have that responsibility for the overview of the Baha'i community. It is their role to ensure the unity of the community, to ensure that the directions, the leadership is provided, and to ensure that the conditions are created within the community and the atmosphere, and for enable every member of the community to grow. However, many of their activities have become decentralised as part of this process. The National Spiritual Assembly has been requested to decentralise, or has decentralised its teaching responsibilities to regional Baha'i councils. At the level of the cluster, area teaching committees, cluster institute coordinators, and a whole range of other activities, a whole range of other agencies are now carrying out the work, which in the past may well have been carried out by the local spiritual assembly and at its table. However, it's not just simply a matter of abrogation. Delegation means providing the agency with the responsibility, but also with the resources and the capacity. It also means regular consultations, it means keeping abreast, it means encouraging, and it means supporting the agency to do its work. And this new focus for assemblies, whether at the national or the local spiritual assembly level, was one which had evolved over the period of the last 25 years. The House of Justice requested that members of the assemblies had a humble posture of learning, that in this process of decentralisation and reorientation, if you like, of the role of assemblies, a humble posture of learning was necessary in two ways. One was to enable that delegation of authority to take place, but also secondly, to have a clear understanding of what it is and how the new framework of action was rolling out. Members of assemblies were requested to work shoulder to shoulder with the rank and file of the Friends, to establish devotional meetings, to be involved in the various aspects of core activities, and as individuals to learn, to grow, and to develop new strengths, new capabilities within the framework of the plan. At the cluster level, a whole new range of institutions appeared. Cluster Institute coordinators, area teaching committees were born, all of which at the right stage of growth were introduced to lend a hand and to advance the coordination of the institute process and the teaching work. The Universal House of Justice has worked through the councillors, particularly through the International Teaching Centre, through the councillors, to introduce new learning, to reinforce the concepts of its message, to explain, to clarify, to assist people, and to encourage people to be motivated to embrace these new realities. Of course, the auxiliary board members have been a critical part of this, and I'm sure all of you will be well aware and have seen the operation of auxiliary board members and their assistance in your communities and your local area. So what we have seen in this epoch and in this series of plans is the emergence of the institution of the councillors through the councillors themselves and also through the auxiliary board members and their assistants is a much stronger, a much more powerful arm than we had in previous epochs. We've seen the institution of the councillors, as stated by the Universal House of Justice, take their rightful place at the head of the teaching work in the various continents and nations of the globe. Let's now turn to the third element of civilization building mentioned by the House of Justice, that is the community. Firstly, let's say that our concepts of community within this epoch have changed. Prior to 1996, the concept of community was largely one of local community and national community. Now, during this plan, the concept of community has changed, to embrace not only those former concepts of community, but now the concept of the cluster have brought about a whole new different concept of community. In a number of communities, because the clusters have been so large and the number of friends significant, those clusters have been broken into sectors, again on the same principles of establishing clusters. In other words, the geopolitical reality of those particular areas has been identified as sectors, and the friends have operated at the level of sector. So we now have a concept of a cluster community, a sector community. In addition to that, the encouragement of the Universal House of Justice for us to work with receptive populations has meant that we now have streams of activity within the Baha'i community that are related to specific groups. We now have a situation where in, say, Manuira, which is our largest neighbourhood, and which is over 1,000 people are engaged in different activities at different times, although it's somewhat lesser at any stage of it in the particular participating in the core activities, we have mainly Māori and mainly Pacifica engaged in that. We also now have a situation where there has been a particular focus on youth and junior youth. The emergence of the junior youth program, the identification of junior youth groups in 2004 by the Universal House of Justice as a core activity and a portal to growth specifically, has meant that the focus on this area of activity has grown. And as you could see from the graph which I presented earlier, that has embraced large numbers of people who consider themselves not members of the Baha'i community, but who the Baha'i community serves and works shoulder to shoulder with in the process of understanding spiritual and moral concepts. So in 2013, the House of Justice also called for a worldwide series of youth conferences, and we know that they were successful in attracting large numbers of youth, and as a result of that, the establishment of a youth culture, the re-establishment of a youth culture within the Baha'i community has become pronounced. And as a result of that, many of those youth are now the key people who are participating in intense settings in neighbourhoods and in the cluster agencies and working across the cluster and in the various fields of both the administration and the expansion and consolidation work. They are also very much involved in discourses in society, which I'll talk about in a minute. The House of Justice wrote to the New Zealand National Spiritual Assembly in February of 2013 and identified that there were two dimensions to the expansion and consolidation work. One which was across the cluster, which enabled all of the friends to participate however they wished within the framework of action, and the other work in intense settings or neighbourhoods. Now, as I also had mentioned, from about 2010, New Zealand began to experiment with working in intense settings and working in neighbourhoods. And as a result of that, little by little, a whole series of neighbourhoods began to have activities within them which were driven largely by younger Baha'is moving and pioneering into these neighbourhoods. The most pronounced and most developed of our neighbourhoods is in Manurewa, specifically in Clendon, where activity has taken place and over 1,000 people are engaged in activities associated with the cause. However, this is not the only neighbourhood. In East Auckland and Glen Innes, in Northcote there was activity, in Ranui there is currently significant activity, in Whangarei, in Palmerston North, in Hastings, in Gisborne, in the Wellington cluster, in Christchurch, in Dunedin. There are also neighbourhoods which are moving forward and advancing with largely youth who have pioneered or moved into these areas, working with the local population and driving forward the processes of the plan and serving the community as a whole. One of the areas of the plan which has evolved and developed somewhat slowly over the last decade or two has been this concept of discourses in society. And under the guidance of an office at the World Centre, the Office of Public Affairs has developed and has focused its activity in a number of discourses which are prevalent in New Zealand society. One of those areas of focus has been to build on the work which was previously established by the Office of External Affairs in the area of race relations. Now, this office had formerly contributed significantly to even the Agenda 2000 of the Race Relations Office. It had also been actively involved in working closely with different race relations conciliators. In addition to that, it had contributed to the establishment of a network for human rights organisations, and it had contributed even to the strategic plan and strategic directions of the Human Rights Commission itself. Expanding on this work, the Human Rights Commission, the Office of Ethnic Affairs, the New Zealand Police and others have worked constructively with the Baha'i community through the Office of Public Affairs to establish now what has become recognised throughout the country as a significant contribution to our society. And that is the Race Unity Annual Speech Awards, even so that Miriam Akamo has presented them voluntarily herself a couple of years ago, and in addition to that, in the website that's been established, one of the speeches by a young woman with an African background has had millions of hits internationally in terms of her speech. So the impact of the Office of Public Affairs and the participation in discourses in society has been very, very positive. Not only has it been in the area of race relations, but also the role of youth, the role of media, the role of religion in society. These are all been aspects which have been addressed by that office. In addition to that, at a more local level, people have been involved in the nature of work and spirituality, involved in the role and the advancement of women, all of these discourses which have Baha'is are participating in, as well as discourses through their own professions relating to health or education, law and environment and a various other number of aspects. All of these are being participated in by Baha'is. Many of the younger Baha'is each year are attending the Institute of Global Prosperity courses, which over a week or 2 week long period each summer, these courses are run, enabling the younger Baha'is who are moving into a university environment to come to grips with the discourses which are frequent in universities and to see those within a spiritual framework, with a spiritual lens, and to see the teachings in relationship to those, and therefore they are enabled to participate effectively in discussions and dialogue with these kinds of discourses. Lastly, the community has been involved in social action. And this has taken place, and the House of Justice referred to this as a spectrum. And within this spectrum, from individual private initiative right through to activities that may be carried out by a Baha'i-inspired organisation under the guidance of a spiritual assembly. Within the area of private initiative, a significant number of Baha'is are engaged in social action in their work as teachers, their work in race relations, their work as educators, all sorts of activities. Baha'is are involved in the environment, a whole range of things. In other words, we are learning to apply spiritual principles in our daily lives. Businesses have been established and become highly successful based on principles, Baha'i principles, who have tried to put into areas of community need the roles and the characteristics of the Baha'i teachings, and as a result of that, many of these have been very, very successful. At a more local community level, growing out of work in intense settings, there has also been experimentation and the growth and the emergence of a trust, which is facilitating action, particularly based on participation of families and youth, looking at the education and the health well-being of some of those in some of those communities which the faith is working in intense settings with. So what are the outcomes of all of this? One of the outcomes is that we've moved from some 900 to move from none to 900 core activities. Activities which 20 years ago we'd even heard of are now commonplace within the Baha'i community. It's what we do. It's the key thing. So the culture of the Baha'i community has been significantly changed as a result of that. Not only has the culture changed, not just for a few individuals, but for the majority of the Baha'i community. If we look at the graph, which I've put in front of you now, we can see participation in core activities and how they've grown from 2002 through 2021. And we can see some initial growth between 2002 and 2005, largely people participating in the institute process and learning through study circles. We can see how participation after 2009 also accelerated, but then dropped off a little bit towards 2015 through 2017. And then in 2018, with the encouragement of the National Assembly, the involvement of people in the bicentenary celebrations, a whole range of things came together, and you can see that the blue area there, which is the participation of Baha'is in these core activities, has been significant. Almost 4,500 people are now participating in core activities. some 1,500 of those from Friends of the Faith, but the other 3,000 odd, or almost 3,000, are adult and youth members of the Baha'i community. So you can see how we have moved from a situation of largely passive community, which had a congregational mentality back in 1996, to a situation where now the vast majority of adult or youth Baha'is are active protagonists within activities in the community. We can also see from this graph the growth from a handful to an increasing number, and then an accelerating number to 1,500 people from the broader community of interest, which shows an increasing outward orientation and an increasing engagement and continued engagement of friends who may not feel comfortable with being Baha'is, but at the same time support the direction of community building that the Baha'i community is going in and participate in that. So there is a space for everybody. It's not an exclusive community. We can see that the acceleration of this has taken place, particularly in the last few years of the plan, where there'd been a doubling of core activities, of study circles. We've seen a trebling in the number of home visits and devotional meetings. And as I mentioned, we've seen participation in core activities to some 75% of adult and youth participating. What is not shown there is also the number of enrolled Baha'is, which has moved from around 3,000 in 1996 to now about 5,120 something Baha'is in 2001. I want to talk a little bit about one of the outcomes, or a series of events which represent the nature of this growth. For the two bicentenaries of the birth of Baha'u'llah and the Bab, we've had a significant number of activities. Over 255 specific events took place for the birth of Baha'u'llah, which shows that these were taking place throughout the country by individuals and by communities at a local level, that they were all involved in these activities, preparing and working with these activities, artistic events, barbecues, film evenings, discussion evenings, artistic performances, all sorts of things were taking place. And over 10,000 people attended the birth of Baha'u'llah. This increased to over 300 events 2 years later, with the celebration of the birth of the Bab, the 200th anniversary of the celebration of the birth of the Bab. And in addition to that, over 13,000 people attended these events. Now, we have not had these kinds of numbers participate at any stage in the history of the faith in New Zealand. There was widespread participation, generated not just by a handful of believers, but by the vast majority. Perhaps a crowning glory of that was an event held in the old Parliament buildings in Wellington. A wonderful celebration took place in which the words of the Bab, I am the promised one, rang out through the old historical debating chamber. These stats and specific activities are not the only things which have happened over that period of 20 years that we can feel very, very positive of. The significant engagement of Māori and Pacifica, which we still have a ways to go, but at the same time is progressing in a very, very positive manner. The Race Unity Speech Awards, influencing national discourse, contributions to the defence of the faith in Iran, New Zealand's role in assisting that. What people don't understand, or may not have realised, that back in 2010 there was a whole parliamentary session devoted to the work of the Baha'i community, and members of Parliament sang the praises of the Baha'i community. Our whole institutional framework has developed, our capability has developed there. We've developed the capacity through statistics to measure growth, to see progress. We've engaged in youth, and we've transformed the culture of the Baha'i community. How did we do it, and what did we learn? We achieved it through purposeful, systematic, accelerated expansion and consolidation. The Training Institute generated an increasing flow of individuals endowed with the necessary capacities to sustain the process of growth. We learn by doing. It wasn't just talking, it wasn't just deepening, it wasn't just sharing ideas, it was actually trying to put these activities into process. Study circles, all of these portals to growth through which youth, adults, and even whole families and people from wider society came into an encounter with the revelation of Baha'u'llah over the last 20 years. We worked in community buildings within the concept of clusters. We also worked in 3 monthly cycles. We looked at the importance and focused on the importance of educating younger generations, and particularly the junior youth activity. We accompanied each other. We didn't do this alone. This concept of accompanying and mutual support and a pattern of learning became one which was familiar in our discourse. We raised our capability to have meaningful conversations with people. Baha'i communities increasingly became outward-looking in orientation, and any soul who was responsive to the vision of the faith could become an active participant, even a promoter, whether or not they believed in Baha'u'llah. There was a concept of the process of entry by troops emerged, not just from theoretical assumptions, but based on actual experience, and a significant number of people found the faith and became familiar with it, some of whom identified with its aims, joined its activities, in many cases from 2000 embraced it. The qualities of faith, of perseverance, commitment, and a readiness to learn came to the fore. Back in 1996, souls lacked nothing for courage, faith, and devotion, but they also supplemented those qualities now with qualities of knowledge, insights, and skills that were the accumulation of 25 years of experience and effort by the Baha'i worldwide community. We are now in a position where, in the words of the House of Justice, the page of that chapter, that 25 years, that fifth epoch, is about to turn, and a new page will emerge with a 9-year plan. We've learnt what the words Shoghi Effendi wrote to us many years ago. We've learnt to be steadfast, to focus, and his comment was, victories are won, usually through a great deal of patience, planning, and perseverance, and rarely accomplished in a single stroke. We've learnt this, and we need to continue as we emerge into the next chapter with a 9-year plan, which will be unveiled in Rizwan 2022. Dear friends, thank you so much for listening.